Good evening, everybody. It's 6:30, so we shall start tonight's meeting. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit is located at the main doors where you came in. We will meet in the Memorial Park. Please note this meeting is being webcast live on the internet. The webcast will also be published on YouTube after the meeting. Mobile phones, can everybody turn their phones off or to silent? Thank you. For the benefit of members of the public watching or participating in this meeting, I would like to explain who everyone is. My name is Councillor Nick Robinson and I'm chairman of this committee. To my right and left are councillors who will be making the decisions on this evening's agenda. To my immediate right and left are officers who will be presenting the applications and providing advice to the committee. The Development Control Committee is a regulatory committee, not a political meeting. The committee will be considering the published papers, examining the evidence brought before us tonight, and will make decisions based on planning reasons. We are guided by national and local planning policy and guidance. At the appropriate time, I will invite speakers to contribute to the meeting in the order set out on the update paper. May I ask all speakers, including visiting members, to speak clearly and keep to the points made on the application on material reasons only. No further dialogue between members of the committee and speakers will be permitted once questioning has finished. All speakers will be reminded of their permitted speaking time and will be advised when they have 1 minute remaining. May I ask all committee members to avoid repetition and keep any comments on each planning item to a minimum of 4 minutes. This evening we have got one item on the agenda, so time-wise we will see how it goes. I understand that planning can be emotive and ask that everyone remains polite and professional throughout this meeting. Thank you. Apologies for absence and substitutions. I've got Councillor Graham Faulkner replacing Councillor Stuart Frost. Any others? Good. Declarations of interest. Councillor Godison.
Thank you, Chair. I ought to mention that I was approached on the way in and it was suggested to me that I might like to consider myself as being predetermined. So I'd just like to make the point that there's a lot of new additional information in this agenda which we've absorbed from last time, and also we've had the benefit of a site visit this time, which also puts a slightly different complexion on the whole thing. So I do not consider myself to be predetermined. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Godison. Minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of October. We will deal with those on the next Development Control meeting on the 10th of November. So, application for planning. Item number 1, land at Oakdown Farm, Winchester Road, Dummer. And Catherine, if you could introduce the case.
Thank you, Chairman. As indicated, this site is land at Oakdown Farm, Winchester Road, Dummer. Members will be familiar with the site where the application was previously considered back in April of this year. At that meeting we had 2 applications before us, the first being an outline application which included a slightly larger site to the location plan that you have before you on the screen because it included land to the south of the motorway as well. The application that we are reconsidering this evening is for the site before you. It is actually for full planning permission. And it's back before the committee for reconsideration as set out in section 1 of the committee report. And this reconsideration takes into account concerns raised by Dummer Parish Council regarding the visibility of the building from Dummer Conservation Area and the consideration of heritage assets, the updated MPPF released in July, and also amendments made to the scheme received in September. And I'll pick on those as I run through the first few slides, which just set out the scheme. So as you have before you, that is the red edge, so it is extending to the north, sort of beyond the M3, right down to the southern end where there's a motorway bridge which crosses into Dummer. Let's go to the next slide. Within the site as currently set out, the purple line that you see on the drawing there is actually an oil pipeline. Part of this application seeks a modest rediversion of that, which is the orange line, which you can see before you. The application essentially is considering the development of the plot 1, which is outlined in green, and then as part of that, reconfiguring some of the land to the south. So members may recall back in April, this is the scheme that we had before us. The main change that has occurred with regards to the overall site is that excavated works from zone 1, where you can see there's a plateau level referred to. That spoil is to be repositioned to the south of the site, and previously we were creating a plateau with the contours that you can see before you, so sort of graduated land up to a plateau height of approximately 155 metres AOD. As members will note, that area of plateau has now changed. It is over a greater level, but actually the overall height has been reduced by approximately 5 metres. As a consequence, the contours sort of stepping up to that site or to the plateau level have increased, and that is particularly notable to the south of the site, where you can see that the contours are much closely together. There's also the extent of a retaining wall that is to extend along the edge of the plateau. There always was a retaining wall, but this is in a slightly higher position now. There is also a very slight change to the site in zone 1, which I will pick up on the appropriate slide. So we had a comprehensive landscaping scheme to accompanying the development, and this is what we had originally. This landscaping scheme hasn't significantly changed, so members will note that it extends right across the site from the north, where we have additional planting, woodland planting, existing vegetation to be remain, so we have some wetland planting as well. And that extends through the site as you're heading in a southwest direction, so you have the sort of formal planting around the building. And then we're ending up with the conversion of agricultural land, as it is at present, into a wildflower meadow. And then towards the south of the site, you can also pick up additional woodland planting. This is also supplemented across the site, mainly to the M3, and again, just slightly to the north of the existing access, with thicket planting. And that's the amended landscaping scheme. So as you can see, it has not significantly changed. So within the site itself, the layout hasn't changed from what we considered previously. So we have a single building which occupies the majority of the site of approximately 333 metres in length, and that is to rise to approximately 24.8 metres in height. To the north of that is a car parking, and then as you can see to the rear of the building, which is adjacent to the motorway, and to the south we also have HGV parking. There's also circulation routes within the site. We also have ancillary buildings such as a pump house and gatehouses. As you can see, access is taken from the A30 via a new roundabout junction, and there would also be a secondary left-in only access for HGVs to the north, which is encompassing in the position of the existing access. Where you can see the star highlighted on the left-hand side of the screen, that is where there's been a slight alteration through the latest amendments to the scheme, where there's a little introduction of a sort of a loop in the internal road layout, and that's to help with circulation of buses. And here we just have the elevations of the building. So as you can see, it extends across the site. We do have some variation in height where we have some single-storey addition to the front of the building, and then it extends over the 4 storeys behind. And as you can see, there is a graduation in the cladding for the building. So we have some sort of dark grey cladding, which is sort of to anchor the building to the ground, and it extends with a lighter grey with a blue band to the top. If I refer members' attention now to the update paper, and where since the production of the report, we have I'd like to make a small correction to the report, where we referred to the woodland planting to the far southwest corner of the site. Depending on where you take the measurement, it was reported previously that the woodland planting would be approximately 34 metres in depth. If you take that planting from the edge of the highway, for the full depth of it is approximately 134 metres, depending whereabouts you take that precise measurement, but it is an approximate. We have received an additional comments from the applicant's agent, providing a small number of comments to the officer's report, which members will see before you. So this is picking up on matters relating to the conservation area, listed building heritage assets, the contribution to the local economy, the weight given to noise mitigation, a suggestion to condition 6 to be amended, and it also confirms that the Section 106 agreement has been agreed and engrossed and is currently for signature. The agent has also continued to provide further comments in relation to biodiversity and trees. A further technical note has also been received commenting on the application, and that has regard to ancient woodland indicators, the biodiversity, the green infrastructure strategy, and also highlights that there has been other development within the vicinity of the green infrastructure strategy buffers. And as a consequence of that note, there has been an amendment to one of the conditions, and I'll point that out in a moment, and an amended plan has been received to sit consistent with that amendment. Members will also note from the update paper there has been an update to the planning history, where the aforementioned outline planning application that was refused back in April, that is now at appeal, and we are currently waiting a start date from this planning inspectorate. We've received 2 further representations, and they've been expressing objection in relation to matters such as priority habitats, woodland, the green infrastructure strategy, the size of the building and the public benefits, and also suggest an alternative use for the site. We've also received a letter of comment from the Hampshire Hospital NHS Foundation Trust, and that picks up on options for the land north of the A30 and transport matters. Officers have since provided comments in response to the agent's submission and also the further representations, where these raise no new major issues that haven't already been addressed in the report, and the members will note that the relevant paragraphs have been cited in the update paper. Turning towards the end of the update paper, members will note there has been 3 amended conditions. Condition 6, which refers to the retaining wall. Condition 24 that refers to the noise mitigation comprising of a 3-metre high barrier, and that is that condition that the plan at the back of your update paper refers to. There's also been an expansion on condition 30 to provide a bit more detailing with regards to the schedules of plants and trees, noting the species, planting sizes in particular, and the proposed densities, and the tree pits. An additional condition has also been added where within the A30 corridor there is a listed milestone, so we've added a further condition to ensure that that would be protected during the construction of the highway works. So the application before you is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions set out within the full report and the update paper and the associated informatives. And that is also subject to the completion of a Section 106 agreement. And as members will also note on page 16 of the agenda, that the application is still to be referred to the planning casework unit with regards to the request for the Secretariat of State to call in the application. I've got nothing further to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. If we could have our first speaker to the table, and that's Councillor Julian Jones. Good evening, Councillor Jones. You have 4 minutes. I will warn you when you have 1 minute remaining, and the button is on the microphone in front of you. Thank you.
Right. Okay. This vast warehouse will retract from the setting of the Dummer Conservation Area and Southwood Farm. It's graded to listed farmhouse. Its access roundabout and Toucan crossing, visited by 1,000 HGVs each day, will increase congestion and delay on the A30. The result will be traffic running through Dummer's narrow streets. Last week, there were 2 incidents on the M3 close to Junction 7 that led to delays. On Thursday, the village was gridlocked, with residents unable to reach or leave their properties. We face the prospect that this will become a common occurrence if the warehouse is built. Developments similar to this elsewhere in the UK experience HGVs waiting for their time slot, parking in nearby residential streets, and antisocial behaviour by their drivers littering and fouling the hedgerows. What of the environment? This development will destroy priority habitat, including an avenue of 67 mature oak trees. Dog's mercury is an indicator of ancient woodland. Contrary to the out-of-date report, it occurs throughout the UK with the exception of the Orkneys and the Shetlands. There's been no attempt to modify the plan to mitigate this vandalism. This site is in the middle of a biodiversity corridor between the North Wessex Downs AONB and the South Downs National Park, identified in your green infrastructure strategy. Its development will result in fragmentation of habitat and severance of this important corridor. Councillors who attended the site viewing saw the Oak Avenue on the historic lane to the village, and I pointed out the woodland sinks in the habitat corridor along the route of the Wayfarers Walk. Protection of priority habitat requires that the proposals move down a hierarchy of principles set out in MPPF 180A and EM4, your own policy. It's to identify an alternative site for the development, mitigation of harm by redesigning within the site, and finally, to accept destruction of the habitat and provide compensation. Mitigation should be pursued before compensation, but no attempt or examination of the mitigation has been undertaken for the full application by either the applicant or the council, for example, by reducing the size of the building or moving the development and the car park westwards. The officer has gravitated immediately to the compensation principle and the assessment of overriding public need as a requirement under EM4, Section 2.
I have 1 minute.
Okay, fine. Under the NPPF Section 175 and EM4 Section 1, the Council has a duty to avoid unnecessary destruction of priority habitat and its biodiversity. Local Plan Policy EM41, subcategories D, E and F also prohibit destruction of woodland and harm to the sinks by artificial light spill pollution. 24/7 operation with high level illumination of the site will disrupt nocturnal species. Today, this area still enjoys dark skies in the small hours of the night when Hampshire has a policy of turning off or dimming streetlights. A vast sortation centre for super efficient distribution of imported consumer desirables that will be transported in and out of your borough by thousands of lorries 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, is a perfect example of economic exploitation at its worst. In 2016, the people of Basingstoke voted to take back control. This evening, you as councillors, you stand at the interface between economic exploitation by offshore investors and the protection of our natural environment and the biodiversity. On which side will you
wind up, please?
Yeah, on which side will you come down? Is all your talk about green spaces and climate emergency just that, talk? Even the Queen has recognised that talk cuts no ice. You have the opportunity this evening to take action by refusing this application.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. Questions for Councillor Jones? I see no hands up. Yes, Councillor Gaskell.
Hi, Councillor Jones. You mentioned light pollution and emissions from lorries. Noise as well?
There will be noise as well. Obviously, there are reversing alarms when the lorries are manoeuvring on the site, and that will affect several of the local residents. In fact, I think you saw in the mitigation at this stage that Ganderdown has been offered to be taken out of residential use, but there are 2 more buildings under construction there at the moment, and also there's a residence of the Keeper's Cottage, which I think was just 35 metres away, and also Kynance, which in fact is part of the main application for demolition. But I spoke to the resident today, and he tells me that he hasn't agreed any sale on that property and hasn't had any recent contact with the applicant. And that is not only going to be subject to the noise of the alarms and the site, but also is just 5 meters from the inbound access road.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Thank you very much. If you could just wipe down the edge of, there's a tin of wipes in front of you, can wipe down the microphone and the arms of your chair and the edge of the desk. I'm sure the next speaker will appreciate that. And if we could have Ms. Illman and Mr. Beavers to the speaker's chairs, please. You have 4 minutes between you. How you divide that up is entirely up to you. I'll give you warning when you have 1 minute left, and it looks like you found the button on the microphone already. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Sue Illman, a Chartered Landscape Architect, Managing Director of Illman Young and a past President of the Landscape Institute. I'm speaking on behalf of Cage and their supporters regarding the landscape issues which are substantial and damaging, both visually and on the character of the landscape. In principle, a key consideration for any development is the intrinsic suitability of the site for the building proposed. This site is fundamentally unsuitable, causing a cascade of problems through trying to place such a large building on one level on strongly sloping land. The consequent problems are obvious. High retaining walls and steeply graded slopes virtually all round, a visually intrusive building out of scale and character with the local landscape. A few statistics help make this clear. The site drops 32 metres from the motorway to the A30. A 6-metre retaining wall with a 3-metre acoustic fence on top enclosed the front car park above the A30. The ridge of the roof of the main building is nearly 32 metres above the A30. The majority of the site vegetation, including the priority habitat and oaks, will be removed. This is to be compensated for by a few dozen trees within the main body of the site, some areas of new woodland, and a large flat plateau sown with wild flowers. If this wild plateau is indeed to count towards biodiversity net gain, then its long-term retention, according to Natural England, should be retained for a minimum of 20 years and ideally in perpetuity. All of this will inevitably make the building and the retaining wall highly visible both locally, particularly from the A30, and within the wider landscape. Turning to policy considerations, EP1 sets out the criteria for development, all of which must be satisfied if permission is to be granted. Criterion G requires that landscape impacts must be mitigated. However, it is clear that the adverse visual effects cannot be mitigated, a view endorsed by your own landscape architect, due to the lack of adequate space for appropriate physical and visual integration. EM1 requires proposals to be sympathetic to and enhance the character and visual quality of the landscape. These proposals do not fulfil any aspects of this policy, which requires a comprehensive landscape scheme to ensure landscape integration, but this is physically unachievable due to the extent of the built form and paved surfaces. The plot is just too small. EM10 requires new development to be of high quality and based upon a robust design-led approach. A landscape-led approach would have been appropriate, but the LVIV has not been used to determine the most appropriate weight for development to be sited and designed. Whilst it's a modern building, there is nothing in its design that suggests any understanding of its context or character, and therefore does not fulfil the requirements of this policy.
Paul Beavers. This report, like others before it, has underrepresented the values of policies that protect against environmental and community damage, its costs and its consequences. A woodland corridor, ignored for its planning status and maturity, set in an ideal north-south configuration, deserves expansion, not felling to satisfy the desire of an applicant. The wood is a stepping stone in an intended 1 kilometre wide strategic corridor of woodland stretching from Alton to Kingsclere that our community needs to reconnect and expand, not to be severed cumulatively by this development. We should no longer traffic jobs between communities, destroy more nature and deny our residents the right to decide how we care for our community and green spaces in a country that is 7th from the bottom internationally for biodiversity out of 240 countries. Our local plan should not be treated as an inconvenient truth. Councillors were given the policy tools by residents to decide applications in an environmentally responsible way and to signal a change in direction.
Could you wind up, please? Thank you. Questions to the speakers? Councillor Howard Sorrell.
Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Beavers, you spoke briefly about that 1 kilometre wide stretch that will go from Kingsclere to Alton, I believe. Your colleague previously spoke or mentions that there would be a wildflower meadow as well as other trees that would be planted. Are the two mutually exclusive? Can the proposed landscaping be part of this 1 kilometre wide highway, for lack of a better term?
It's a bit convoluted, the question, but the corridor as mapped by the council, and remember this corridor, as you say, stretches, it's our one and only major strategic corridor, and it's been mapped by the council in its own green infrastructure strategy. And that corridor stretches from, as it were, almost the end of the warehouse up through into Hounston Fields and onto the golf course. It is severed the whole way. It's severed already by road, but what's happening is we're putting in housing on Hounston Fields and on the golf course, which is several hundred metres wide. If we're going to do the same with the warehouse, several hundred metres wide, we're not going to get joined up woodland. We're not going to be able to get... The whole point of this is that in the long term, we're trying to reconnect habitats that have been completely fragmented. Unless we actually start to join them up or make them really, really close, species are not going to move. And you've already heard about things like retaining walls. You've already understand how wide this site is. All the light, the noise, the pollution that's going to be caused. Even the ponds, if you think about it, the wetlands, attenuation basin, is going to get flooded from water from the car parks and the roads in the system. Sorry, if that gives you a flavour of the issue. The grassland is outside. I'm not supposed to say anything, but let's face it, the grassland is part of the appeal. What do I say?
Thank you. If you could turn your microphone off, please.
Sorry.
Any more questions for the speakers? Councillor Harvey.
Thank you. We've heard this evening the first speaker talk about the visual impact from Dummer. Given your representation in terms of landscape impact, would you care to comment on the visual impact perhaps from Hounston Fields on the other side, being that the housing development? Do you see it as both from Dummer but also from the other developments taking place on that corridor?
Sorry.
Yes, that's right. Okay. Well, I have had a look at that, had the opportunity to look at that today, and clearly it's not there yet, but the housing is going to be moving down towards the main road, towards the A30, and at that proximity, then clearly there is going to be a visual relationship between the new housing proposed and the site. It's inevitable. There is planting intended at that end of the site, but you can already see right up to the top of the field. And those, again, it's this levels issue. And, you know, if you've got some of these buildings are quite high, so, yeah, there is definitely going to be a visual relationship between them, beyond a doubt.
Thank you. Any more questions? No? Thank you very much. If you could wipe the edge of the table, the microphone and the chair arms, that would be much appreciated. And if we could have Mrs. Davies, Mr. Barker and Mr. Thomas, please. And yeah, and Mr. Hoy. Yeah, I'm sure. I seem to have got it sorted. Okay, you have 4 minutes between you. How you use that is entirely up to you. I will warn you when you have 1 minute left. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good evening. My name is Jo Davis from Avis & Young, and I'm Newlands Planning Consultant advising on this application. In April 2021, committee members resolved to approve this application for a new logistics hub, bringing more than 2,000 new jobs to Basingstoke and £54 million worth of annual injection into the local economy. However, the legality of the resolution was challenged by Dummer Parish Council. This was hugely disappointing for my client, Newlands Developments, and for those people looking for jobs and training. As Newlands have always stated, it wishes to be a long-term partner with Basingstoke and Dean Council and in delivering employment space to meet market and consumer demands and the rapid growth of e-commerce. The proposals before you have not fundamentally changed to those that were assessed by your officers and approved in April 2021, and in April and again today, officers are recommending approval, consistent with your local plan, policy E1. So what's changed? In September 2021, 2 simple amendments were submitted and consulted upon. The first change is to reprofile the rear plots and the shaping of the land. This now allows it to sit 5 metres lower than the earlier proposals. We believe this is a real positive. The second amendment is the inclusion of additional public transport bus stops cited in the application site to deliver the proposed future public transport system back into the town. These new stops will reduce the distance between the bus stops and the entrance to the building, making it easier for workers to use the bus rather than to drive to work. In addition, my client has agreed to fund bus services for 3 years to put them in place at day one to ensure that a bus service is economically viable. Since the last committee, we're taking on board the comments that were made on the 7th of April. Although not required from a planning perspective, my client has agreed to buy the 3 Ganderdown cottages at the request of the residents. It is important to highlight that the officers agreed that the measures my client had previously proposed to mitigate the impact on noise on these homes was acceptable, and that my client was doing so not because he had to, but because he wanted to be a good neighbour. This is also the case with the property at the north of the site, which was suggested was not subject to contract. That building is subject to contract in terms of planning. And this has been addressed through the Section 106. I'd like to turn then to the point about biodiversity. Biodiversity, much has been said about this evening, and the loss of the trees along the farm track. We recognise the growing emotion attached to these trees following the April Planning Committee. Members did not take the decision lightly then to remove these trees, but having undertaken detailed assessment of the quality, number of species of the trees and along the lane and the contribution they make to the ecological network, and
You have 1 minute.
and the consideration of the challenging topography of the site, they need to be removed in order for us to be able to deliver the scheme. However, 76% of the tree canopy across the site that is existing will be retained as part of this proposal, and we are proposing to plant 71 new trees, all of which will be at least 3.5 metres tall. This leads to a biodiversity net gain of 43%, which is 4 times above your policy requirement, and as I said, and also 7.2 hectares of new mixed woodland planting, including native species and woodlands. At the time of economic uncertainty, these proposals will seek to play a pivotal role to meet the unprecedented demand of this sector in logistics and the government's need for economic renewal and recovery. The future prosperity of Basingstoke, absolutely. It seeks to deliver new jobs hand in hand with new homes that are currently under construction, as was alluded to by people. And we would simply ask you to take your officer's recommendation and support today's application. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for the speakers? Councillor Goderson.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask you, Mrs. Davis, you commented on the fact that you fully appreciate the anxiety and concern that has been raised with the idea of felling this avenue of trees. I presume you will have considered the possibility of rearranging your applications slightly in order to retain them. But then you've also commented that in your view they need felling. So could I ask you, firstly, did you consider rearranging the application in order to retain them? And why is it that you feel they need to be felled? Thank you.
There's two key points there. When looking at the site and looking at the distance we have within the site, we've looked at a number of options, and the most efficient way of dealing with this with regard to the topography of the site and the levels, it prevents us from doing anything other than losing those trees, because we believe the north-south tree boundaries either side of the site are much more important to the connectivity of the woodland on the site.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, so could I just ask you also to develop, why do you say they need to be felled? I mean, you're saying they need to be felled simply because you prefer them not to be there.
No, so when we're looking at this site, and we were looking at the scheme that was proposed, we had to look at the constraints across the site, and the largest constraint across the site is the topography. We needed to deliver a single development plateau in order to meet the occupier demand and requirements on the site. And we've worked on the scheme very hard to retain the site as proposed. I'm going to ask John, who's the commercial manager, to refer to the extra point. John?
I think the other thing just to add to that is that we've had to look at the development plateau across the site in order to deliver the building and in order to provide as much visual screening as possible. So that's why the site has been, is effectively lowered across the majority of the site, and that's why the trees had to come out.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs Davis, thank you for that. I received, like probably members, your updated flyer in the post for the weekend. It does say on there that you have actually bought the homes, the 3 Gandertown cottages. Is that, firstly, is that actually a current status? Is that true? And what about the 2 properties that are being built adjacent to number 1? And then you've got Trensard's cottage up the hill, and of course the bungalow on the site. Could you just clarify for me, please, that status? Because it's quite important in terms of the mitigation and some of the information on our report.
Absolutely. Can I ask John from Newlands to talk about the commercial deal?
Yeah, so to answer your question, we have agreed, subject to planning, to purchase the 3 Gandertown cottages. And the same applies to Canaan's cottage. I know earlier it was referenced that that isn't the case, but we have got a legally binding agreement with the owners there to purchase that property, again, subject to receiving satisfactory planning permission.
Go ahead, Councillor Tomlin.
I have a different question. Do you want to take orders, or can I ask that now?
Carry on, please.
Okay. Right. So moving on to another question. Just looking at, I've become a warehouse studier, I'm afraid. Up in East Midlands, there's a site of a company that's possibly in a very similar industry to whoever may buy this property. But it says they have yellow features set against a horizontal grey banding to the main warehouse, which grades from dark to light, allowing the mass to blend into the sky. So my question is, yes, I hear what you're saying, but then you put a big blue stripe on the top, which seems contrary to what I've been seeing. Thank you.
You're correct. There is a blue, the banding that we've put forward has got blue at the top of the band at the moment. If that is an issue for members, that's something I believe that could be conditioned.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Court.
Thank you, Chair. I have a query on the jobs you've stated. You've said here 1,300 direct jobs, 975 indirect jobs. I'm assuming the direct jobs are to do with the construction phase, and the 975 are, well, I don't know. So perhaps you could just clarify for me? Many thanks.
So no, all the jobs are referred to there. So the direct jobs are jobs that are employed within the warehouse. The indirect jobs are jobs that service the warehouse, such as catering or things that go into the site. The construction jobs are in addition to that.
Many thanks.
Councillor Freeman.
With regards to public transport and bus services, what happens when your initial funding runs out? Are we going to look at the bus ending up being stopped? And also, what is the bus service currently like in Dummer? If it's anything like the other small villages around here, it's really not very adequate, and the buses don't generally start till 6 o'clock in the morning, and they finish around about 10 o'clock in the evening on a weekday. You know, where are these buses coming from, and what about workers that work outside those hours? How are they going to get to work?
Chair, if you mind, I'd like to pass that question to Matt Thomas, who's the transport consultant
please
working on the project.
Hello, good evening. You're quite correct. The public transport at Dummer at the moment isn't appropriate. That was one of the first things we considered as part of this application through discussion with the County Council and also the public transport provider. Consequently, the proposal is for £720,000 worth of funding for a new demand responsive bus service, which is effectively an Uber for buses, if you like. So it's not fixed route, it's not fixed time. It responds very well to shift working patterns, for example, but also covers a very large radius, probably 15 to 20 kilometres. Through discussions with Stagecoach, Stagecoach believe that 3 years funding, i.e. the amount set out in the 106, is sufficient for that to become self-sustaining. After that period, they expect quite a significant demand from the adjacent residential areas. Thank you.
Councillor Ganesh.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around the number of jobs that you have mentioned. On what basis these assessments were made? Is it with the current technology available in the market, or the considered the future in 5 years down the line with the technologies available where there's no need for much labour-intensive jobs? So if you could clarify that and what these jobs assessment was based on. Thank you.
So the job assessment was based on very detailed analysis that was done working with your consultants, so your Arabs who dealt with the economic consultancy piece with us, and they're based on national multipliers. They do take on the logistics being dealt with through automation. And therefore we're still focused on those jobs. We also have taken some information from operators who operate the businesses of this size. So we're confident that these are jobs that will be there in the long term. In terms of the range of jobs, John, do you want to just touch on the range of jobs?
I think just to add to what Joe said there, and particularly I think this probably answers your question around automation, that the jobs that are put forward here are in discussions with the occupier that will be taking the building. That building will already at day one be very heavily automated. So the jobs that you see before you account for that automation in the building. As you'll be aware from the application, there are a number of mezzanine floors in this building, and a big proportion of those mezzanine floors will have automation on it. So the jobs that you see before you are the jobs that take into account the automation that will be taking place in this particular facility. I think I'd also just like to add the point about the type of jobs. Because I think there's always this confusion over these types of buildings creating low-skilled workers. The range of jobs that this building will accommodate are ranging from high-skilled managerial, accountancy, engineering. Yes, there will be lower-skilled jobs and warehouse operatives, but there'll be a real range of job opportunities for the local residents of Basingstoke.
Councillor Harvey, second question.
Thank you. I'm just picking up that point about the interested party and the way that you phrased that, because obviously we aren't dealing with that. We're dealing with your application, which isn't the interested party, that's you. So the issue becomes one of what this warehouse site could deliver in the context of jobs, in the sense that square footage and such might well be in the region of perhaps 3,000 jobs if you looked at it in the purely square footage sense against testing. Whereas you're suggesting the analysis you've made is around 1,300 jobs in the context of automation and in the context of your interested party. But we can't consider the interested party because that's not what we're here to do. So we have to work with that in terms of understanding the relationship between the two. And also the fact that a warehouse that was not your interested party might offer significantly greater levels of employment were it to be a traditional model, not the automated model you're describing. I would then like to understand why you've chosen to, and I understand it's perfectly legitimate to do so, but why you have chosen in your employment and skills plan to leave that element of securing the jobs or securing the elements of a greater understanding, a greater detail on that, for our benefit as a committee and our benefit as a council and our benefit as a community to a later date. You're allowing that to be left in the 106 agreement to be discussed later rather than now. You've secured the construction jobs, I understand that, but this matter of employment has been left to a much later date to be detailed and defined. And I'd like to understand why you've done that, in the sense of you just described the point about the interested party. Is it for their benefit, or how does that work?
Do you mind if we do that as a bit of a double act? I'll start with John.
So I think just to answer your question around the occupier that sits behind this application, this is a full application for a very bespoke facility. So that is why these numbers are based on that said occupier, because of the facility that's being built. It is being purpose built for a specific end user.
Can I just take on an extra point and also apologise? It's not Arab, it's Stantec, and I think if I refer you back to, if I refer you to the appendix, it very clearly explains how those jobs have been assessed. So there's a confidence in terms of the interrogation of those jobs that they will take place. The second point that you make, Councillor, is with regard to the skills and training and the question of why we're holding back on that until a later stage. The skills and training plan is very detailed. We've worked that through with your officers. However, we are building and retaining the buildings. Ultimately, the person who will train those will be the occupier. So we require them to sign up to that with the council, with the college, in order to ensure that those jobs are delivered by the occupier, and that's why that's weighted to a later date. But if you look at this skills and training plan that sits alongside the Section 106, it's very detailed, and that will be an opportunity to be scrutinised at a later date with the operator, and only if that is acceptable will that piece be dealt with through the obligations.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Howard Sorrell.
Apologies for looping back round to this. Your answer that you gave earlier regarding the trees, now that I've had time to think about it a bit more, I'd like some clarity. You gave sort of two separate answers about why the trees can't be retained. One of them you said the word efficiency, it's the most efficient design for the site, and then one of them you said the topology of the site or the topography of the site precludes you from leaving the trees intact because you need the whole site to be at a single level. The efficiency answer implies that you could just do something different that's slightly less efficient. The topography answer obviously implies that you have a very specific vision in mind, but still doesn't preclude you from slightly altering that vision, basically. So is there a good reason other than desire from, I'm thinking, an architectural perspective or a geological perspective? Give me some science as to why the trees have to go, please, if that's at all possible. Thank you.
Before I give you some science, can I give you some policy position? So your local plan and the policy that's referred to here, the local plan inspector concluded that as a council in your local plan you hadn't provided sufficient land for large-scale logistics. And therefore a policy should come forward in order to safeguard and allow the application to be sound. That in effect is the policy that this application is being considered against, and therefore just by the very nature of logistics, you had plenty of employment land but nothing that could deliver logistics, i.e. large-scale warehousing. When you look at large-scale warehousing, the requirement, so the need that's identified through the figures that are presented in the analysis, both at the local plan and in our submission, is for large-scale single-form platform buildings, and that's what's being proposed here. And I think for us that's the reason why you get this. Also, that logistics should be close to motorway interchanges. So therefore you have a site that fits both of those, but then you have to look at the logistics of it. I think then when you look at that and you look at that large scale plateau, you then have to look at what we're doing in terms of responding and mitigating it. So we've got 43% of the biodiversity net gain. It's a requirement of the local plan, 33% above what your policy says. We're delivering 18 acres of new woodland and additional planting, and we are planting 71 new trees of over 3.5 metres to mitigate and respond to that. So I think it's the policy position, the need and the nature of logistics, and the site. So I think it's all three put together rather than just one or the other.
Councillor Ganesh, second question.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to coming back to you about the same question that Councillor Goodison and Hodshaw had just asked, and your answer was, as a borough council, we've got the responsibility to provide this land, but there was a choice between these trees can be saved and delivered and destroy these trees and deliver the jobs or the warehouse, but you choose to do this latter in order to deliver this warehouse at this site. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think I'm going to say there's three ways, if I may. I'm first ask John as the developer, and then just take it across to the ecologist that obviously has the detailed information with regard to the trees.
I think just to clarify the point around why we've had to lose the trees in regards to the development that's before you today, and it is to do with the topography of the existing site and then the need to create a development plateau. And when we've taken into consideration the level that that plateau needs to be at to provide the necessary visual mitigation, but also takes into account development constraints with regards to the oil pipeline, the level of the A30 and the level of the plateau, we've got to have the plateau at a certain level so that it works. And unfortunately, by doing that, the trees need to be removed. So I think just to clarify that point about the plateaus.
Peter?
Right. I think it's important to understand the context of the trees. My job is to evaluate their importance, both in a sort of spatial scale and for their own intrinsic appeal. Yes, they have intrinsic appeal. They're mature trees. I understand that, but from an ecological point of view, they are, it is woodland in the very broadest sense. It doesn't function particularly as, a fantastic ancient woodland. It's not ancient woodland. I think that's important to understand. It is important in a very local context, and on that basis, you need to make your decisions in a proportionate way. If it was of national significance, that would be, must be treated with significant weight. Obviously, the lower the significance, if it's of local significance, it needs to be treated with less weight, and the lengths that you would need to go to in order to mitigate for woodlands of different statuses, for example, might change. In my professional opinion, the replacement woodland planting that is pretty extensive around the site will compensate for the loss of those trees. It may take some time, but overall, the site is isolated. We've got the M3, you've got the A30, both significantly isolating the site from everything but mobile species. So from my point of view, I need to be understanding how the woodlands around the site might function. They'll provide, excellent connectivity for mobile species, because those are the types of species that are going to use it. It's already isolated. So from my point of view, it's great. I think the grassland on the site will complement that woodland. At the moment, it functions as a woodland edge, and I think the biodiversity officer has made that comment, and that you know we're enhancing by I don't know what percentage it is, a huge percentage. So it's significant benefit.
43%. And the other thing just to highlight there is that actually the analysis you've got in terms of the landscape and visual impact is 15 years. So the trees that are being planted by 15 years will have that significance.
Thank you. I would appreciate to people sitting at the back if we didn't have any interruptions. The speakers do have a right to speak, and they've got a right to speak without laughter and without interruptions. So if you could behave appropriately. Are there any more questions for these speakers? Councillor Court, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I thought you were going to say a second question. The question is actually nothing to do with landscape. It's to do with vehicle movements. And also whether you have potential traffic growth you've identified throughout the, shall we say, the lifespan of this particular proposal. Also the sort of traffic you're thinking about, and possibly a comment on the adequacy of the M7 junction would be appropriate. Many thanks.
So I'm going to pass that across to Matt, but obviously we have no Hampshire County Council or Highways England objection to this application due to the work that we've done pre-app and during the application. But Matt?
You've just taken the words out of my mouth, actually. So we've worked very hard to get to that position, as you can imagine, with the statutory consultees. The fact is that our assessment is very robust. We've taken into consideration a significant growth for the next 10, 15 years. We've taken into consideration all of the committed development in the area, large-scale committed development, and the mitigation is future-proofed to take account of all of that background growth, plus the traffic effect from the site. And as Joe was saying, all of that has been agreed with Highways England and Hampshire County Council. Clearly, Highways England have a greater steer towards the motorway junction, and again, we've assessed that motorway junction in detail, and they're satisfied that the effect of the development is okay at that particular location.
Councillor Gaskell. Councillor Gaskell.
Thank you. Yeah, I sit on a liaison committee for an incinerator, and the biggest complaint I get is light, and that's usually just when there's a shutdown, so it's just for a couple of days a year maybe. This is going to be running for 24 hours a day, and you've got well, probably 120 bays, I guess, which are all going to be lit up. How do you mitigate against the light, and how do you mitigate against the noise of the reversing lorries? Well, yeah, thank you.
Councillor, rather than going into the detail of that, both of those things were assessed during the noise impact assessment and the lighting impact assessment that were done as part of the environmental impact assessment, and the conclusion was that the measures that are in place are acceptable in terms of the impact that they will have on the immediate area. So I haven't got that detail to me, but ultimately that's been fully assessed and cumulatively assessed through the environmental impact assessment, and your officers have concluded, along with your environmental health officer, that the scheme is acceptable.
I see no more hands up, so thank you very much to the speakers. And if you could have a wipe down with the wipes that are available. Do we have Councillor Putty here? No. In that case, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Taylor, you have 4 minutes. I'll warn you when you have 1 minute left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. As councillors, our mandate is to work to make this borough the best possible place for our residents, with a view to both the present and the future. I wish I could convey to you the enormous landscape impact that this proposal would have in this area of our borough. Some of you could have seen this for yourselves had you been permitted to take the viewing bus to the key vantage point on the ridge to the north of the site, where a panoramic view of the whole area can be seen. Sadly, the viewing panel was denied this opportunity to see for themselves how the proposed structure would annihilate a beautiful rural scene. I'm happy to say more, but you'll have to ask me questions afterwards because I haven't got time in this 4 minutes. We have had the expert assessment of landscape impact from Miss Illman, for which I'm most grateful. And of course, we've had the word of our own officers dealing with that. What more can I say about ecological impact? With both a climate and an ecological emergency declared by this council, how can it be right to destroy valued, ancient, irreplaceable oak trees to make way for what? An industry that churns out tons of plastic in the form of packaging and unbought goods as waste. And again, I'd be happy to expand on biodiversity if you ask me afterwards. You don't have to. Urban design. I have to mention urban design. This southwest area of Basingstoke is, as you know, about to become a key residential area with some 1,750 homes in the pipeline. The edge of the Hansonfield development is just over the A30 from Oakdown Farm. Dummer and North Waltham are on the doorstep of this proposed development. How can we possibly say that we're serving our residents to the best of our ability if we allow this mix of industrial and residential development? When people who've lived and thrived in this corner of Basingstoke for years find that they are suddenly going to be sharing their roads with HGVs and their views of the vast warehouse construction that is a literal blot on the landscape. Please note the vital comments made by our own urban design officers. They, quote, object on the grounds that the proposed scheme would represent an overdevelopment of the site by virtue of the siting scale, massing and appearance of the warehouse, which would cause harm to the character of the area. So there you already have 3 clear reasons for refusal: landscape, loss of ancient woodland and urban design, reported by our own officers and therefore fully reasonable and defendable. Just want to mention employment. Can I plead with you not to be persuaded that the potential for employment should be in some way an overriding reason for accepting this? Basingstoke doesn't need this, not at all. If you look at the experience of other localities who've received similar distribution developments, we are going to be bitterly and belatedly disappointed. For instance, the largest distribution company, which I won't name, is increasingly moving towards mechanisation and robotics. I will quote a Lancashire newspaper in May of this year. They say 2 years on, residents who opposed the blank warehouse plans, this is the largest distribution warehouse complex that we have, are warning others of the huge expansion of the online giant as they mourn the loss of Greenbelt while still awaiting the 2,500 to 5,000 jobs promised. I continue the quote. Employment opportunities was the justification for concreting over the land. Job figures are disputed, but the total new jobs created are thought to be around 300. Just to finish the quote, the campaign leader claimed St Helens Council had been taken to the cleaners, with the jobs boom not materialising and locals left to deal with all the problems associated with the site. End of quote. Please, colleagues, don't let us be taken to the cleaners. Let us not be taken for fools. If this is given the go-ahead and this monstrous building is placed at the gateway to our town, please make sure that I am on record as opposing this. I don't want this to be a legacy that I have anything to do with. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Councillor Taylor, and please do not invite Councillor Taylor to extend her speaking time because that will not be allowed. So it'll be questions on fact. Thank you. Councillor Howard Sorrell.
Thank you, Chair. You just briefly touched on some figures saying that it was between 2,500 and 3,000 jobs were promised, or was it higher than that? And then you said about 300 were actually delivered. So if assuming it's about 3,000 to 300, say 10%, do you think it's reasonable, in your opinion, for us to assume that we'll only get the 10% figure?
It's very difficult to say because you can only go by past experience. I can only quote what the newspaper said. I'm assuming that this is the same company that is occupying the warehouse, but unless we're allowed to say what it is and compare it directly, I can't do more than that. But obviously it's reasonable to look at other people's experience and learn by it, because otherwise all we've got are words. Thank you.
Any other hands? No? Thank you, Councillor Taylor. Questions to officers? Sorry? Sorry, Councillor Golding, I hadn't seen you in the room. Councillor Golding, you have 4 minutes. I'll warn you when you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for your time reconsidering this application this evening. I appreciate it's not an easy task, and it is a question of finding balance between different policies and priorities. However, I would ask that you refuse this planning application. I hope those of you who are able to go to the viewing panel will have seen firsthand the huge impact it will have on local environment, as well as the massive increase in traffic that it will bring. I don't believe you have to accept this application this evening. Indeed, within the report, our own officers object to the application. Our landscape officers object. Our urban design officers object. Our tree officers object. They all say it does not meet our policy requirements. Indeed, our biodiversity officers also offer various objections, but then come to the strange conclusion that they should waiver their opinion in line with public need. And there is the judgment that's actually yours as a committee this evening. You have the choice to say that the promised jobs outweigh the desecration of the countryside. You can choose to listen to the 100,000 people who said they do not believe this is true through signing a petition, including 4,000 local residents who have said that they value protecting that woodland environment on the site more than any advantage a warehouse might bring. And I don't think those people are wrong. Job vacancies across the UK are at a 10-year high currently. Unemployment is nearly down to pre-pandemic levels, and employment rates here in Basingstoke and Deane are better than the Hampshire average and significantly better than the UK average. So I do not believe we are in a position where we must accept new jobs at any cost, especially not in a sector that we know is all aiming for automation within the near future, and their promise of new jobs that rings hollow. At the last meeting, you were assured that this would be guaranteed in the Section 106 agreement, but such agreements can only be upheld through legal injunction, which this authority has not undertaken previously. And as Councillor Taylor has just explained, other local authorities have seen similar promises for similar sites before and not seen the results of them. In addition, in Basingstoke, we have brownfield sites that are already providing new opportunities for employment locally. With housing, we always say we want to build on brownfields first. So why is it different for employment land? We have new industrial units at Viables and another recently vacated brownfield site in Basingstoke that could also provide logistics facilities. So why is this greenfield site being pushed through? Why are we considering ignoring our own policies such as EM4 and objections from our own officers to destroy a woodland that's over 100 years old and provides a vital habitat for local wildlife? You know as well as I do that newly planted trees do not provide the same rich ecosystem as the priority habitat that already exists on Oakdown Farm. Our officer teams have been very clear that it would be preferable for that woodland to be retained and that destroying it, thank you, is against British Standard 5837 and that it will take decades to regain that habitat. This development is clearly against EM4 because significant harm to biodiversity will occur. It's a question of whether this committee feels there is an overriding public need for this to be irrelevant or not. We have struggled to marry our planning decisions with our commitment to the climate emergency because we don't have enough relevant policies, and I know this committee has struggled with that. But it is not the case for the ecological emergency we just declared at our most recent meeting. EM4 is clear, and this development does not fulfil the requirements for ignoring it. I would urge the committee to refuse the application on this basis, as well as it being contrary to our Design and Sustainability SPD. The block warehouse achieves none of the requirements within that SPD and should therefore be another substantial reason for this committee to refuse the proposed development.
Could I ask you to wind up, please?
That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Golding, and apologies for not seeing you in the room earlier.
Well, I was blending in, obviously.
Thank you. Questions for Councillor Golding? No, I see no hands, so thank you very much. Questions to officers? Councillor Howard Sorrell.
I'm sure our legal advisor will inform me if this isn't a question that's allowed. I'm hoping I can seek some clarity around the answer I was given earlier regarding a single level plateau. Can you clarify as to whether or not applicants are bound to the idea of a single level plateau? And apologies if I'm using the wrong terminology. If they're irreversibly bound, if there's no possible opportunity when submitting sites for submitting applications for logistics sites and for large-scale industrial sites, basically, could they put the car park at a different level to the rest of the site, say 5 metres up, 5 metres down to retain the trees? Is that possible? Obviously, it's not part of this application, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask the question. But if they were to resubmit an application with that one factor change, does that follow our policies? Is that allowed? And can you answer that? Thank you.
I think the first thing to point out is that we are bound to consider the application that we have before us. I mean, if a revised scheme came before us, then we would consider that and the merits of that. But at the moment, we have this scheme before us where you are looking at a considerable sized building, which of course will need a considerable sized area around it for the parking, the circulation, and also we've got the matters such as the drainage, etc. So all of those matters have come to the scheme that we have before us tonight, and that is what we are considering. So whether or not it would be possible to have different levels on different parts of the site, then that's a matter for the applicant. As I said, we have these drawings and this is what we are considering.
Okay, thank you for that answer. The clarification I would like is as to whether or not the application was specifically bound by a policy to submit the application as it is. That was my understanding from what I was told by the speaker earlier, was that they could not possibly submit an application that didn't have a single level plateau because of a specific policy. They didn't give me a policy number that I noted down at least. I'm just wondering if that's true, if there is a policy that specifically prevented them from submitting an application with different levels. So,
thank you, Councillor. And just, I suppose, for the record, it's clearly not for me to speak in terms of what the applicant's position was, but I think the point that was being raised was that to meet the requirements for storage and distribution, there would be a requirement for a building of a particular size. Normally, these sorts of buildings aren't clearly on one level, and that's effectively what's led to the design solution that's come forward. There isn't a policy as such which says any storage and distribution that comes forward has to be on a single plateau, no. But I think that was the general point that was being raised, that this type of development and the policy emphasis around EP1, where it specifically requires storage and distribution and the changes that the inspector made, if I could just refer members to page 69 and paragraph 83.5, the inspector actually made changes to the, or required changes, sorry, to the local plan to effectively allow for sites to come forward ahead of any DPD for storage and distribution specifically as an individual planning application. So I think it's the combination of those 2 points that was being raised as the reason why it's come forward in the form that it has.
Councillor Ganesh, followed by Councillor Court.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 questions, if I may. The first one is in the report, page 45, Natural England recommend consultation with AONB officers. Could you clarify whether you were able to consult with AONB officer? What was the outcome? Any report or any sort of recommendations made from AONB officer? Thank you.
So consideration would have been given at the consultation stage as to the relationship of this site to the AONB. It's not in the AONB, it is also a distance from the AONB. So as such, due to that distance, no consultation was undertaken. Had there been a consultation undertaken, then it would have been reported to you.
Thank you. And my second question is, could you confirm the floor area proposed exceeds the local plan set by the borough, and this site doesn't include in our economic master plan for the economic growth? Thank you.
So the floor area within the site is above that which is set out as a guide within our local plan, and consideration has been given to that. Of course, what we are considering here is a floor area on multiple floors rather than a single level building. So of course we've got a smaller building, but we can actually have a greater area of floor. So that is within your report. I'll probably just find the section where it is, but it is before you, and the explanation for the floor area is within the... Yeah.
So just to clarify, so if we consider multiple flows, so it would exceed the proposed local plan.
Thank you, Councillor Ganesh. So the local plan itself doesn't set a specific floor area. There is reference to 122,000 square metres, which in the supporting text, so just to be clear, it's not policy. The policy is EP1. And effectively the way that we've assessed this application is to look at the amount of floor space proposed. And as Catherine's mentioned, because it's on effectively multiple floors, we've assessed the application as being acceptable in those terms, or effectively there couldn't be an in principle objection on those terms when you take into account all the other aspects of policy EP1 and the provision of storage and distribution, which, as I say, was a point of soundness for the local plan in terms of why that was acceptable. The other aspect of it is that even if you took the 122,000 square metres, if that was embedded in policy, which it's not, but even if that was the case, the analysis that we've done in consultation with planning policy colleagues and the report from Stantec, which was the advisors to our planning policy colleagues, which is set out in Appendix A, that's effectively stating that even on the 122,000 square metres, you would still require a site area of a similar size. So the difference in floor area effectively is because of the stacked nature as opposed to the size of site. I hope that helps.
Thank you, officers. Thank you.
Councillor Court.
Thank you, Chair. I've seen in the report there's a comment by Thames Water that they don't have any infrastructure capability to actually service this, and I wondered whether there'd been a further state from them at all on the plans. And there's a second one, and that's to do with traffic. So if you could give me the first one, please.
So you are correct, there is reference within the report to the consultation response from Thames Water indicating that there would be need for an upgrade in order to be able to service that site. Now, generally those are undertaken in conjunction with the Water Authority under separate legislation under the Water Industry Act, but also I would draw members' attention to page 141, where there is a condition which refers specifically to the wastewater network upgrade, which is condition 21 in any event.
Thank you for that one. The other one relates to the exercise that's been taken by HEC on the traffic. Now, as far as I can see, they've taken into account, from the various statements here, the traffic that would come from this development. But I don't think they've taken into account any of the other developments that we're talking about potentially as well. So that is just the current plus the current development they're talking about now.
Thank you, Councillor Court. No, so the transport assessment has effectively taken into account all committed developments. So it's not just the development traffic, it is all other committed development known and committed at this stage.
So it's only the ones that have gone through planning and that you know of directly?
So it's those that have gone through planning and effectively those it's out in the local plan. So things like golf course, Hampton Field will have all been taken into account in that.
Many thanks.
Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the Gandertown cottages, we've got on the first page of our thing about the provision of the noise and road traffic surface, and it actually goes on to state the fence in front of Gandertown cottages. We heard from the applicant, as I understood it, that they have an agreement to purchase. I just wanted to make sure that we would capture the two houses that are being constructed at the moment within that, because if we didn't, then we'd have to have the mitigation regardless, I would understand. And with the 106, if this is sold on to an end user, how does the 106 move to the end user to actually provide, or is it all only with the developer? That was my first question.
With regard to Ganderdown cottages, the section 106 that is proposed does seek to secure the acoustic fencing and the low road noise surfacing, subject to Gander Down cottages being in residential use. So if they were in residential use, then that mitigation would be required. Now, the Section 106 accepts that if the Gander Down cottages have been demolished or they've been subject to, for example, planning permission for the change of use, so they are no longer in a residential use, then that mitigation wouldn't be required. Now, you refer to other properties being constructed, and that's something we probably just need to clarify. If you could just bear with us.
Then my other question was, I think we've got condition 10 listed as lighting schemes. We don't know anything about it, so we're being asked to look at possibly approving an application or otherwise without knowledge of what the actual lighting scheme would be. It would be delegated to officers. Is that true? Can we do something about it or can we do something about seeing it somehow?
Okay, so we are seeking full details of the lighting scheme, and that is what that condition is requiring, so we have that further consideration of the actual detail. And again, that's notwithstanding any information that we've received so far. I would also refer members to condition 38 on page 145, which is a further condition, which again is seeking the submission of that the lighting scheme and having regard to the ecology of the site in particular. So there are actually two conditions there that are looking at that lighting proposals. So it does give the local planning authority, in conjunction with, for example, our environmental health and landscape officers, that first opportunity to have another say in that detail.
Sorry, Chair, if I indulge me, just one thing. I've just forgot we had a brief discussion with the applicant about the blue stripe. Is it possible we can condition that the building colour and structure should be grey fading to nothing, as in many applications of similar buildings throughout the country?
So members will note on page 136 of your agenda, condition number 4 controls the materials. Now that could be reworded to be, for example, I say prior to the construction of the building, then details of those materials be submitted to the local planning authority for further approval. So there is an opportunity to secure that through condition should members resolve that that is your way forward.
Thank you. Please, Mike.
Sorry, Councillor Tomlin, you mentioned additional cottages being built. We were just trying to understand that in terms of beyond the 3 Gander Down cottages.
Yeah, if you've got Gander Down cottage number 1, he sold his land on a planning application, I think 2 years ago. There are 2 houses in construction at the moment, which are, to all intents and purposes, Gander Down cottages, except obviously they probably won't be called that. Whether it could be 1A, I have no idea what they're going to be, but they're actually in construction. So they will likely to be built, looking at it, within the next 6 months. So if people move in, we're walking into a situation of 5 Ganderton cottages, not 3.
Could I have a representative of the applicant up to the Speaker's chair for a moment, please? Thank you. The question that's been asked, and it's quite unusual to bring you back to the table, we don't normally allow it, but I do recall this planning application that there is an extant planning application to build more houses, 2 more houses in the Gander Down area. Will you be offering to buy, if obviously they are now building plots which have a value to somebody, and that value will be hugely diminished should this scheme go ahead, just as the effect on them will be the same as it would be on 1, 2 and 3 Gander Down cottages. Could you give us some indication of what you would intend to do with those those plots.
Chair, those plots are outside of our control. When the applications were submitted, your environmental health officer looked at the mitigation of those units, and we believe was satisfied and raised no objections to those buildings. So that's our position on those two plots. We're not in contract with those. We've told you exactly what units we are in contract with.
Okay, so your offer to buy is 1, 2 and 3. What we may call now, for the sake of it, 4 and 5, will suffer the consequences of the noise and the problems that this development will cause if it goes ahead.
Can we take that in 2 stages? As part of the mitigation measures that we put forward, the requirement for those noise measures was not required for the full application. It was required for the outline planning application. So the outline application that the committee refused. So from that perspective, those mitigation measures are not required for those Ganderdown cottages. We have worked with the residents as good neighbours to acquire those units because of their residential impact, having lived there for a long time against that road. So that's our position on that.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Chair, I think the issue is in relation to clearly the acoustic barrier. So the status quo, if you like, is that the acoustic barrier would be provided. The Section 106 allows for the fact that effectively, if the 1 to 3 Ganderdown cottages weren't in that use, then it wouldn't be required. So that's the way the 106 is sort of be geared. In terms of the additional dwellings, I think we would need clarification from environmental health that has been factored into that part. And therefore, I think the resolution would need to be subject to that confirmation prior to the decision being issued, but that is perfectly achievable within the resolution.
Thank you. Any more questions for the officers? No? Oh, Councillor Gaskell.
I'm just looking at the map there, and in the centre at the top next to the pond, there seems to be a building that's appeared. Could you explain what that is?
I can, yes. That property is the curtilage to Kayance, and you can just see the very sort of faint outline of the property itself. That is one of the properties that is part of the planning application for demolition.
Thank you. I see no further hands up, so we move to debate. Anybody like to start this off? Thank you.
Excuse me. Yeah. Well, I'll kick off anyway. I'll kick off. I'll mention the site visit on Friday, which it came for me as should I say, a bit of a disappointment because, you know, having read a lot of the reports that support and objections, etc., I was perhaps expecting something a little more visually amenable or whatever. Most of the site is fallow field, and frankly, it's blighted by the M3. mercifully, the embankment is quite heavily treed, wooded, and so it's screened. But nevertheless, it's not the ideal place on the planet. And likewise with the trees. Obviously, the trees are very fine trees, and we all love trees, etc. But they are stuck on a disused road which used to run through to Dummer, but now can't go anywhere because the M3 is there. So it's just blocked. So you've got a broken up sort of road, and at the top end is the disused industrial estate. So the whole place is really quite dilapidated and derelict. So I would just mention that it wasn't quite the pristine countryside that I thought I might see. Perhaps I'll make the other point that I've written down. It's obviously a very complicated application with a lot of interrelated issues and a lot of awkward policies of, are they still valid under the fact our LP is out of date? How does it compare to the NPPF bit, etc., etc.? So I stepped back and I made a sort of thought, which I've written down, is given all that, why would I go against the officer's recommendation? You know, on what basis would I do that? And I must admit, I'm moving towards the view that I would support the officer's application because it is technically very complicated, and I think that would be safer ground.
Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. Wow. Size of and the impact of the landscape. We're looking at the size of this building. I mean, there's a certain distribution company, shall we say, who has a very large warehouse in Bristol. And a BBC television programme recently said it was their largest. But if you start to try and find out, it looks like it's 75 metres by 125 metres. This one, we're talking about 330 metres by 150 metres. There's another one in the same usage of this other company, shall we say, that is in the East Midlands, which I've personally had a good look at. And this one is, again, it's got multiple layers in it. The footprint is, it's smaller on the ground, but it goes up more. It's slightly confusing, the information you get. But it's only 15 metres tall. This is 25 metres tall. So we've got almost, I wouldn't go so far as to say the biggest, it could well be the biggest warehouse, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's damn well up there. And interestingly, in Bristol, they're at an industrial park on the Severn Beach, and in the East Midlands, we're at an airport. They're not in the countryside. They're on what you could almost argue is brownfield land, but I don't know the actual accuracy of that statement. But it looks well used for that purpose. The one in Bristol has its own motorway junction, which is rather interesting, and the East Midlands one is on an established route right next to the M1. So we've heard from the people from Dummer and there that there are policies that we could be considering. The policy M5, the M5 we ensure development would not prejudice delivery of our green infrastructure strategy. Well, we've talked about green corridors and whether it isn't historic woodland, but it's priority habitat. I think our officers have done, and of course our tree officer is very adamant about the quality of the trees. And we've got, again, well, policy M4 picks up about priority habitat. I wonder about pollution. We've looked at the pollution report, and it says that Ganderdown COPs and peak COPs will be above acceptable levels. You know, I should not be too surprised, giving 24/7 accelerating diesel HGVs. I mean, that's surely going to be generating lots of particulate and NOx pollutions. Okay, we talked about light pollution. There are cows, and we're not quite sure what the lighting will be, but I guess 24/7 will light it all up. There was some concern about it being seen as too glary from the M3, I read, but yeah, that's as may be. But the traffic, I've looked at the traffic. It's incredibly not. It's just not satisfactory. We have comments that were saying Junction 7 and Junction 8. Now, we've got all sorts of issues. I've lived in this area for 30, 35 years, and I've used that junction down to the 303. And the number of times, I wouldn't say I've had near misses, because I think I'm a better driver than that, but there's been all sorts of traffic and lorries and every crossroads which way and that going on. But it would appear that if you look at the highway standards, that junction is not built with the appropriate 2 kilometres apart. It's actually, I think the applicant says 570 metres, whatever, it's certainly half a kilometre or whatever, not 2 kilometres. And there's a standard there that says if you have junctions like that, you must have a link road that would alleviate it. Well, we haven't got a link road going south, and there's some tenuous report that, don't worry, we've got a link road going north called the A30, which of course only links from the A303 to the M3. It's got nothing to do with the M3 to the M3 and between junctions. So just factoring the going south of 500 lorry movements in the morning and in the evening, or sorry, AM, PM, presumably that means over the 24/7. That's an awful lot of lorries going in and out, 1.5 minutes or so between lorries, and they'll be like London buses, I'm sure. So a bit concerned there that Highways England have gone, well, the reports seem okay, and we've looked at the recent accident records in the last 5 years. There are no trends for accidents. Well, that doesn't factor in there'll be 500 lorries going in. So I find it all very wishy-washy, and that colleague councillor has been talking about the future development and how it manages that. Well, we know what our plans are for that part of the borough, so that's another interesting thing. And then finally, looking at jobs, I mean, that's clearly a touchy point, but looking at the methodology, yes, it's industry standards based on square meterage per worker, per whatever, operative, whatever you want to call it. Now, interestingly, on this television programme on the BBC, what the presenter was talking with one of the technicians who was going into the robotic warehouse, and he was going above the ground floor. And to go up there, he had to log in to the control systems to inform the robot control that the route he was taking around the building. That implies there's no one up there. So we potentially got floors up here that will be heavily automated and, if you like, dark warehouses. The ground floor, fair enough. Yep, could have a lot of people. And the table that we've been given, there could be 761 people floating around on the ground floor. Well, I'm not going to argue with that, but there's an assumption that, okay, it's automated, so let's say 35% of the workforce per square meterage, whatever, on each floor is all that's going to be there. Well, that's 200 people, but I'm kind of seeing evidence that it's not 200 people, and straight away there's half the jobs have vanished because it's automated. It's all estimates, and we heard from Councillor Taylor, clearly there's some examples of jobs not coming forward. So I don't buy that job front. It's a great selling point, and I think there will be jobs, and we can't ignore that. But we have to look, I think, at what we're told to look at is the harm greater than what we're going to develop. And I'm afraid there are lots of policies we've got that would suggest that this application is contrary to many of our policies. So actually I would move for refusal on the grounds of well, it's not sustainable development, landscape impact harm, policies EM4 and 5, and an EP1, which of course says it's got to successfully mitigate the landscape impact. If we're going to, we're going to put this development in that place. So I'm quite happy to move for rejection on those grounds.
Thank you, Councillor Tomlin. Before bringing you in, Councillor Hussey, could I just bring you in?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm a St Helens boy, born and bred, so I know exactly what Councillor Shell is referring to, and I will verify what she said. The interesting thing about this report for me, the opposite report, is it states quite clearly that the proposed development would have an impact on the landscape. It then goes on to say, however, it talks about mitigation, but the impact on the landscape. Now, I'm just going to, for my sake, please listen to me, to take out little bits of the different policies. EM1, development proposals must also respect the sense of place, sense of tranquility or remoteness, and the quiet enjoyment of the landscape. We're talking about a warehouse here which is big enough to accommodate the Majewski Stadium and St Mary's football ground. The stadiums, not the pitches, the stadiums. And it's going to be lit up at night, a bit like an evening match at the Majewski Stadium. And when you look at the mitigation measures for the light, the bulk and the size of the building at a gateway into Basingstoke.
Councillor Hussey, sorry to interrupt you. Could you bring your microphone a little closer to you? Thank you.
The mitigation measures don't come close to addressing that policy statement I just made from EM1. Then we've heard, and it's in the report, about our green corridors and at the need to extend, to integrate them. And what this does is exactly the opposite. It fragments them. Now, they've got mitigation measures, they've got to plant new trees. Well, new trees to replace 100-year-old oaks, by the time they're equivalent in terms of habitat, nobody in this room will be alive. We'll all be gone. That's hardly mitigation as far as I'm concerned. That's closing the door after the horse is bolted. So I don't think the mitigation measures come anywhere near to addressing the issues that this application creates. And I would quote from EM1, EM4 and EM5. And they're the reasons that we should refuse this application. So I will second Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Councillor Hussey. Mike, you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to a few of the points raised because Councillor Tomlin referenced the point about the proximity of Junction 7 and Junction 8, and I think that's been acknowledged even in Highways England's comments as well on the application, that the junctions are closer than would perhaps meet current day standard, but that has been taken into account in their assessment of the application. So the existing context is known, that assessment has been taken into account, and even with that existing context, their position is no objection, having taken account of a sensitivity test of, if you like, a potentially greater amount of traffic than the transport assessment considers is likely through automation. On the jobs front, there's talk about other sites. I mean, I think just need to remind members that it is about this application that needs to be considered, not necessarily what may or may have happened on other sites. And in particular, I draw members' attention to the very detailed report that we had commissioned with Stantec, which is included in its entirety at Appendix A, and the reason for that is it's a highly technical piece of work, but also to be absolutely transparent about how that calculation came about. So yes, it is an assessment in terms of how that job number is arrived at, but the 1,300 is actually consistent between both the applicant's estimations and our own. And you'll note from the report in particular, there's a lot of disagreement on a lot of these issues. So the jobs part has been really robustly sort of thrashed through, if you like, between the applicant, the local planning authority, and our appointed consultants on that point. So from our perspective, that 1,300 is a reasonable planning judgment to apply to the overall assessment. Just picking up in relation to, because Councillor Hussey referenced the way the report is put together and the references to landscape impact, I think it's really important to bring this back to the context of policy EP1. Policy EP1 is the reason why storage and distribution is potentially permissible as a site outside of a DPD process. It recognises, as has been stated in both sort of for and against, if you like, that there will be landscape impacts. But I draw members' attention to that particular part of EP1, where it specifically sets out on page 68, so just for the relevant quote at point G, that where, because of it being a criteria-based policy, where it's able to successfully mitigate the landscape impact, which will include provision of sufficient space for appropriate soft landscape green infrastructure, appropriate location of development within the site, and utilise a design, layout, built form and use of materials in order to ensure that any landscape impacts are minimised. So the reason why the officer recommendation came down the side of approval is effectively because, as set out in reason for approval number 2, those landscape impacts are considered on the whole acceptable when you take the entirety of the site, including the additional plateau level and the amount of space that's provided within the context of that particular part of the policy. So it's not simply a test of will the development be seen or will there be any impact. It's considering in that very specific policy context as the reason why the officer recommendation formed its particular view.
Councillor Hussey.
I did recognise that by saying that I didn't think the mitigation measures were sufficient to offset all the harm that this building, this proposal would create. So I made an oblique reference. So I'm agreeing with you in terms of viewing EP1 in context of EM1, EM4, EM5, but I disagree with your conclusion.
Thank you. We've got a motion and a seconder, but I'd like to see if there's any more debate, and then I will come to reasons so that anybody else wishes to enter into the debate. Councillor Howard Sorrell.
Do we specifically need to debate, or can I speak on behalf, like in favour of the motion? Do I need to speak against
part
it?
of the debate? You could say you're fairly open on what you say.
Okay, that's fine. In which case, I'd just like to say that we can't realistically mitigate our way out of ecological and climate collapse. We just can't. You can mitigate the impacts in theory, but in practice, we're slowly chipping away at much more valuable biodiverse landscapes and replacing them with far less biodiverse landscapes. And it's just not a practical approach to take to a long-term view of our country and our ability to, or our planet's ability to sustain life, which might not be a relevant planning reason to refuse this application, but it's worth noting that what Councillor Hussey and Councillor Tomlin have said is incredibly valid, and I'm very much in support of their motion. So,
Councillor Ganesh.
Thank you, Chair. As a borough, we should be encouraging or bringing in investment and creating more jobs, and we should be mindful of the future, especially considering post-COVID climate. We've had a huge unemployment issue, not huge, but considerably higher comparing to previous years early this year, but we've seen that improved. In August, in August it's fallen from 4,655 in February to 3,820 in August. So we have already seen that significant improvement within this 1 year, and we've heard from the Chancellor this morning saying that the post-COVID economy will be bounced back at some point in a couple of years, where we probably may not need to seek for hundreds of or thousands of jobs in the borough. So that's one of the point when we consider the amount of jobs that will bring, and we should also consider about how much the technology can be introduced, which we alluded earlier in the conversation. And we can clearly see from landscape officers' comments that this is something we, in paper, like earlier Councillor Howard Sorrell mentioned, in paper we can mitigate, but can we mitigate the 70-year-old to 120-years-old trees being fallen, and how long it'll take for those trees to give the same amount of impact to this nature? I don't want to be part of the councillors who approve that to happen in this borough, I think it'll be very wrong, and I'll be in favour of the motion to support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Listening very carefully to what everybody has said this evening, both from the applicant, from the residents, and also what the officers have written in the report and the update paper, and trying to balance the argument, because they are balanced. There is a number of things I think that are important in the debate. There is absolutely no question that we need jobs in Basingstoke, and it would be wrong of anybody, I think, to argue that we don't. And we shouldn't be ignorant of the fact that those jobs are needed for very good reasons. And there are many residents that I represent in my ward, and you all represent in your wards, that would be very welcome of those jobs. That doesn't mean that this site is the be-all and the end-all of those jobs in Basingstoke and Dean. This site has to be judged on its merits within the red line that's presented as the application before us. The responsibility for that rests somewhere else in creating those jobs and creating that inward investment. That's got nothing to do with us tonight. And bandying figures around the 54 million are irrelevant to the application that's in front of us. The application is the red line based upon its merits. Its merits are based upon the application's impact in that location, on our landscape, on our environment, on the immediate communities around it, that have obviously raised questions this evening that are going to require answering beyond this meeting. And it also rests on our policy framework. And there are arguments on both sides, and I can guarantee that the applicant, in a future position, if they choose to, where their motion to be carried, will no doubt be arguing that the landscape impact is not such. I think it is such because of where it is placed in relation to the AONB, where it is stated that the officers should have been consulted because of the potential impact of views associated with the AONB. As minor as they may well be, they are a part of the conversation. I think there's a context more seriously of the immediate visual impact of the site to its immediate surroundings. And I think the landscape impact of that, you cannot any way other than argue, is huge. The significance of the building landed in that location in its context of being not just the size of the building itself and height, but in the sense of how the topography is going to be changed, is significant. I think there is an argument about the trees, and we can go backwards and forwards on this one, whether they're ancient or not, whether they're good or not. It may not be designated an ancient woodland, but our trees officers tell us the quality of some of those trees are relevant to what would potentially be an ancient woodland. We're told that our trees officers object, we're told that our urban design officers have had problems, we're told that the landscape officers object, we're told that Thames Water have got problems in relation to the sewage associated with the site, and that's why they require a condition before anything is done or anything signed off or the building's occupied that the sewage issues are thoroughly resolved. And we know, don't we, that in this part of our community, the impact of this development and the impact of what has happened in development running up the valley has had huge implications for those living at the bottom of the valley. And so that is an important matter to consider when it comes to sewage and comes to that particular issue. The surface water points are different, and that's dealt with in the report differently. So on the basis of the argument that's in front of us, on the basis of what colleagues have said and the questions that have been answered this evening, I come down in favour of the recommendation for refusal, and I don't believe the application does fulfil the mitigation that's required to meet. I don't see how you can. But the point being, even just on a simple policy framework, I don't think it meets it. So I support the recommendation for refusal.
Thank you. Any more for debate? Councillor Howard Sorrell.
Just to clarify, Councillor Harvey said recommendation for refusal. I think he meant motion for refusal. Anyway, my main point was that listening to Councillor Harvey speak has inspired a train of thought, and it's as follows. We, as a council, are all representatives of the 140,000 people that live across the borough. We, a few weeks ago, voted to move to recognise that we not only are in a climate emergency, but we are in an ecological emergency. As representatives, we each speak on behalf of thousands upon thousands of residents. So you can effectively say that all 140,000 residents, because all of us represent that total, all essentially voted in favour of recognising the fact that we are in an ecological emergency. And the fact that we can make that claim means that those 140,000 people also are against this application, don't think it should go through, purely based on the fact that we have recognised that it is not suitable based on that vote that we took. It's a slightly tenuous train of thought, but it's a train of thought nonetheless. The point is, I agree with everything that everybody has said in favour of this motion, and I'm hoping we can now vote on it.
Chair, I appreciate there's a motion on the table has been seconded, and I know you've asked for reasons, but I think it's important to remind members in terms of the points set out in the report, particularly at section 1, around the way in which this application is being reconsidered, which I know has been touched on already, but in terms of the consistency point and the point around what has actually fundamentally changed between the committee's consideration, the Development Control Committee's consideration of it in April, and the Development Control Committee's consideration of it 6 months later, when the key physical change on site is not the building itself or its position or anything else. The change is in relation to the plateau level. So that's the only fundamental change between the 2 points. The second point is, in terms of putting forward reasons, I suppose I would just... members would need to be extremely mindful of the fact that a larger application, so the outline planning application, was refused, but it was refused solely on the effectively the impact on landscape. And I simply raise that because other policies have been quoted, other issues have been quoted in terms of suggesting or making a motion before the reasons have been stated. But if that outline application on a larger piece of land with more built development, of which this development effectively is part of, was only refused on a single issue as a decision of the council was issued. It's not the resolution, it was an actual decision on that outline application. That would need to be factored into any reasons put forward for this motion, Chair.
Councillor Hussey.
I'm just looking at paragraph 1.9, page 18. The officer's report states, this application is therefore before members for redetermination. This must involve a genuine reconsideration of the application, and in doing so, members may determine the application differently from the original committee decision. Now, that original committee decision was, well, I wasn't sat. How many people here tonight made that with that original decision? The minority. The majority of this committee tonight are new to this committee. They have come in with fresh eyes, no predetermination. The result is different. That isn't a problem for me, and it shouldn't be a problem for any other member of the committee.
Chair, if I can come in on that, the previous decision is a material consideration, and it was a decision of this committee. It's not about what individual members thought. This council made a decision at this committee, and that is a material consideration that you've got to have regard to. It is right, you are free to arrive at a different conclusion, but what you must do is consider, the reasons for doing that, bearing in mind the decision that you took last time.
Councillor Harvey.
In thinking this through, I mentioned in debate the points around jobs, and I am concerned about that. And I'm concerned about that for the reason that in the debate that took place, the applicant chose to state quite clearly the intent in regard to a user who would take on the facility. They made that, they openly mentioned that, that was part of their presentation to us this evening. Therefore, they have introduced that point. And in that point, my concern is that the employment and skills plan at the moment is left in the sense of a relationship between the applicant and the council and does not include that third party. That third party would have to become related to that, and that is a concern because it's not tied down. That is not the reason I am objecting to the application. It is a point of debate and it is a concern that I have, but it is not the reason I am objecting to the application. My concern is in the context of our policies and specifically on landscape and the comments that have been given by our officers in that regard, and that's where I am coming to the motion that's been moved by colleagues.
Chair, can I just say that things on the employment and skills plan, they're in the Section 106 agreement and they bind anybody who takes an interest from the applicant in just the same way
that the applicant's given the covenant, so it runs with the land.
Thank you. Councillor Tomlin, you moved for refusal. We need some reasons.
Sorry, Chair, I did give those, I thought, and it's not changed anything at all. It's the landscape, and that seems consistent with what we've been told on the previous one. And I've also cited policy M5 and 4. I don't believe it's going to prejudice the council's, our green infrastructure strategy. I will say we had this application, we had a viewing panel. The last application was in COVID. We didn't get to see the site. This time we were able to go into the site. We were able to see the trees. We were able to understand the tree officer's comments. The whole thing is, as I share that with Councillor Hussey, that we're redetermining it with what's in front of us. And sometimes what's in front of us is also knowledge we've gained. And therefore, those are the three main policies. I mean, I've got lots of other reasons, but I will stick with those.
Thank you. Did I see your hand, Councillor Ganesh?
Thank you, Chair. I can agree with Councillor Tomlin's comments around the trees, and because we were lucky enough to see the actual site on Friday, and relate ourselves to the comments on the report about those trees, and the avenue of oak trees particular appears to be historic interest dating back to 1872, and we were able to see the report stating that net gain of for biodiversity around 42%, but in my opinion, I do not believe it mitigate, or it is not it is not sufficient enough to. Thank you.
Mike, I think you want to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I fully appreciate the vote needs to be taken. So I'm trying to be brief, but just to assist the committee, the two reasons, and just for clarity, the two reasons I've got down for Councillor Tomlin. One is landscape impact in terms of the overall development. The other is, you mentioned policies EM5 and EM4 and prejudice to the green infrastructure strategy. So very specifically, you're talking about connectivity between, having taken into account the lack of objection from biodiversity, also the overall net gain and everything else. You still come to the view of that. I'm just seeking clarification on that point. That's the basis of the motion, or the reason that you're putting forward.
Yes, it is. Now that we see, I've now been able to find or become aware of the biodiversity green corridors. So that's background information that I have, and I consider that is we're going to potentially sever it, or what I think the word was. So again, we've had identified the priority habitat woodland, so that's been newly put into the report. So that's where EM4 was suggested as well. That I don't believe there's an overriding public need for the proposal that would justify destruction of the priority habitat woodland.
Okay, is there anybody else wants any more input before this goes to the vote?
Yeah, you would, just before the motion's voted on, you would require absence of a section 106 reason for refusal as well, because the 106 inside of that's relatively standard. Sorry, Councillor, just to come back on the point around the biodiversity, again, it's just the reason we're just trying to be really precise is to understand the reason for what's voted, but I also just need to remind members again that the outline application for a wider development with less biodiversity net gain was not refused on biodiversity grounds. So not the reconsideration of this application, the outline application where the decision has already been issued was only refused on landscape grounds. I just make that point again in terms of how committee members need to consider the application as a whole.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded for refusal. Those in favour of refusal? I'll make that 9. And those against refusal? 1. And I will abstain. That's been refused. Catherine.
Thank you, Chairman. So the resolution is for refusal on the landscape impact of the development and the prejudicial impact on the green infrastructure strategy and its connectivity, and the no overriding need to justify the destruction of the priority habitat. And again, the second reason for the completion of the Section 106. I think I've got that correct. Sorry.
So just to clarify, I think there's 3 reasons for refusal. One is in relation to the landscape impact. The second is in relation to the biodiversity and the impact on the GI strategy in terms of impact on connectivity. The fact that there's not an overriding public need for it in terms of policy M4 with regards to impact on priority habitats, and then the Section 106 agreement not being signed at this stage. So those 3 reasons, Chair, for the clarification of the decision.
Thank you, everybody. That's the end of the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for your input, and thank you very much to all the officers who put a huge amount of work into this. Thank you. Good night.